Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online child developmental psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in emotional development and attachment. That's right, today we are in our feels and we are talking about attachment. So let's jump right into it. Beginning with a basic operational definition of emotions. Emotions are an experience that includes your body's physiological reaction, your interpretation of the situation, your communication with another person, in your own actions. Facial expressions are often reflexive. There's evidence that emotional experiences are not arbitrarily paired with facial muscles movements around the world. That is, there are no people who frown when they're happy. Adults make approximately the same expressions as infants do, even including infants who are born blind and thus have never seen facial expressions. So we're going to talk about kind of universal aspects of emotions and some cultural differences. Now, interestingly, as I stated, there seems to be universal emotions and kind of ways to express some of them, but there are still some differences. But some ones do stand out. So, for example, like I said before, there is no known culture that when they're happy, they make a frowny face. Not a thing. This suggests that there's some kind of universal biological genetic kind of evolutionary feature of our species that we're in certain, all cultures, all humans have experienced a set of the same emotions and display those kind of basic emotions in very, very similar ways. And some of those universal, often called basic emotions, there's different terms, but these are kind of you can just think of them as basic emotions, universal emotions. Those include happiness, sadness, fear, anger, interest, and disgust. Biologically based, they're automatic and unlearned. They play critical roles in motivating and organizing behavior. So these are some of the universal emotions, and you can think kind of evolutionarily speaking. Again, this is all like theoretical. You're looking at your infant, and you're like, oh, I wonder if this infant is happy, and the child's smiling, and then you're like, oh, the infant is happy. But imagine like if that wasn't the case, and it was just completely random, and your child is like, smiling, but the child is actually like surprised or sad or something along those lines, or conversely, like the child is crying at night, but instead the child is just having a rave party, having a time of his life. So we kind of need it makes again, everything makes sense, but sure. This makes there's a rational evolutionary reason why we kind of on some level need kind of this universal unlearned biologically based set of emotions so we can communicate with newborn babies, for example, and properly attend to their needs and or assess their emotional state. So, for example, one study in 1971 from Ekman, kind of famous psychologist in this field, explored the similarity of people's emotional expressions in 5 countries: the US, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Japan. Showed participants, what these researchers did was showed participants a photograph of a person making one of 6 emotional expressions. They include happiness, disgust, surprise, sadness, anger, or fear, aka those basic emotions. Much similarity across industrialized countries. All showed high degrees of agreement on matches between facial expressions and emotional terms. Accuracy of 80 to 90% for most of the photos. So basically what the researchers did was show a photo of a man smiling or a man or a woman frowning, and then asked the participants either from one of those 5 countries. They asked the participants, hey, what is this emotion conveying to you? Or what emotion is this photo or the person in this photo making? And the person is smiling, hypothetically, and then a person will say, oh, that means happiness. And across all 5 countries, most of the participants, 80 to 90% of the time, would guess the correct emotion. And correct, I mean that like the person is making a happy face, and that's the researchers like, okay, this means happiness. Therefore, let's see if other people think it's happiness as well. So 80 to 90% of the time, there was consistency across the culture for most of these categories. However, there are some differences, just because some researchers argue that some emotions are more recognizable, maybe some are more universal than others, even within these basic emotions, but you can still see very high levels for about 3 out of 5 of these, that is happiness, disgust, surprise, are pretty consistently identified across these 5 industrialized countries. To rule out the possibility of environmental effects, such as the effects of like industrialization and a beginning kind of like globalization. Ekman and colleagues also examined an isolated culture, the Four of New Guinea, which had minimal exposure to Western culture. The four participants in New Guinea were asked to show expressions while imagining a number of events happening to them. Their expressions were consistent with those that people from other cultures would also associate with each scenario, despite the fact that this culture had almost no contact with Western cultures. The findings were taken as strong evidence that certain facial expressions are universal. So basically, what this part of the research, or this aspect of the research project did was, again, recruit from these people in New Guinea, the four who have minimal exposure to Western culture. And what they would ask these participants to do was they would lay out a scenario. So they would say, imagine your friend has come home and you're very happy to see them. And then they would ask the participants to make a face indicating that expression. And sure enough, they would smile when it's happy. Again, suggesting that things like emotional expressions, facial features, and response to emotions, there are sets of ones that appear to be universal across humans. Happiness being kind of a prime example. Cultural display rules. Culturally specific rules governing which facial expressions are appropriate in a situation and how intensely they should be shown. Some cultures dictate that people must express emotions very intensely, whereas others dictate that people should refrain from strongly expressing emotions. The Kaluli of New Guinea show emotions intensely or dramatically. The Utku Inuits strongly condemn public expressions of anger, while the Balinese, Southeast Asian ethnic group, prefer emotional, quote, smoothness and avoid strong displays of emotion, either positive or negative. So kind of the idea here is that cultures, although have universal emotions, or there are universal emotions across all humans, cultures have specific rules where in some contexts it is appropriate to show emotions and others they aren't. And kind of the degree to which you express emotions varies across cultures. So here we see three different cultures. One in New Guinea, one in Canada, and one in Southeast Asia. Differing in the appropriateness of expressing and showing emotions. So our New Guinea group having cultural display rules that allow for and kind of stress and teach that it's okay to show emotions, while the Canadian group much more strongly condemns some emotions, but it was like some, not all emotions. Anger is strongly condemned. So you can see kind of variations in here. And this is going to reflect like what is respectful in a given culture, and it's also kind of tied to kind of larger kind of norms within society. For example, people from collectivist countries, again with all the caveats we've talked about with collectivism, e.g. Japan, tend to mask or restrain their emotional expressions. People from collectivist cultures tend to conceal their emotional expressions by presenting a more neutral or pleasant face. This affects where on the face one attends when deciphering another person's emotional state. Because muscles around the eyes are harder to control than muscles around the mouth, Japanese are more likely than US Americans to attend to the eyes. US Americans are more likely than Japanese to attend to the mouth because it is a greater source of information than the eyes. So you can imagine, again, broadly speaking, all the caveats of collectivist culture, including some of the previous slide included other collectivist cultures. But you can kind of conceptualize this as, okay, because I have to, or am more concerned about how my behavior affects the group, I may be, one cultural display rule associated with this, and there can be variations, would be to kind of mask or restrain my emotional expressions, because I don't want to really upset and disturb like the harmony of the group. Again, there could be other collectivist explanations and cultural display rules, but this is just one example. But interestingly, cultural display rules not only impact, literally your displaying of emotions and when and where you display emotions, I should say, but because of that, you're going to have to attend to different parts of the face to understand the emotions of other people in your surroundings. So if someone, for example, a culture is very verbally expressive, or at least facially expressive with their emotions, you can maybe attune more to their face because maybe they have like a massive smile on their face or a massive frown face. But however, if you have a culture that really stresses restraint in displaying emotions due to their interpretation of collectivist values, you are going to not be able to rely so much on the face because you're trying to mask and restrain visible emotion. So instead, you'll look to other parts of the face that maybe it's a little more difficult to restrain emotional displays, such as like eyes. Thus, you can hook up different cultures, so like eye tracking technology, wherein you just basically sunglasses hook up to someone to, or whatever, have them put on a pair of sunglasses that track where their eye movements are, so you can track where different ethnic groups or cultural groups look on a face when trying to interpret emotions. Display rules also contribute to ritualized displays. These are culturally idiosyncratic facial expressions that are not recognized universally. For example, embarrassment, which is both a universal expression and culturally specific expressions, that is, ritualized displays. On the left, the photo on the left of the slide is generally recognized to be an expression of embarrassment. So kind of looking away, almost kind of a little smirk. The image on the right side is recognized by people in some Asian countries to be expression of embarrassment. So there are basically ritualized ways that we express emotions, that even universal emotions, or maybe kind of semi-universal emotions. So for example, putting hands together like this little emoji, could be described as a ritualized display. Granted, I don't know how universal that actually is, that emoji. But maybe, hey, maybe a research idea. Don't steal my idea. / I'll never do that research, so I don't really care. Emotional schemas. We also develop ways of thinking about emotions. When we experience an emotion such as sadness, we draw memories to understand what we are feeling. The emotion sadness is labeled, connected to our memories of other sad experiences, and judge whether our expression of sadness is allowable or appropriate in a given situation. Quote, big boys don't cry. Can make it difficult for young boys to get help or understand their emotions. Sadness will therefore more likely be expressed through anger / aggression, a more culturally acceptable expressor of emotions among boys. So what we have here is kind of a way of thinking about emotions. So we, experienced emotion. You are trying to connect it to previous memories to be like, oh, am I actually like sad right now? And I remember that one time that my beautiful fish got eaten by another fish, and I was really, really sad. Therefore, maybe I'm sad. But then again, that fish cost $1, and Petco was already torturing those fish. So I don't really know. I don't know if my mental breakdown right now is appropriate given these circumstances. So you're kind of like thinking through your emotions and evaluating the appropriateness of like the severity of the emotion given kind of like the scenario that happened to you. Now, this also can play out in other ways. So for example, we have kind of gender expectations and gender roles that include the appropriateness to display emotions for boys and girls. And this is, declining somewhat, but still kind of the roots of this is definitely still present today. So like I said before, big boys don't cry. So kind of the idea here is that if you're a boy, you should never like express sadness. Because to do so makes you a girl, which is against your gender and therefore bad. And some negative consequences include it because of that, that literally you're being basically like taught that like you almost like biologically can't cry or you shouldn't cry. Those things can kind of get meshed together in like a kid's mind. But ultimately, this can contribute to a boy, not a young boy, being unable to understand their emotions because they are kind of by definition not labeling the emotion as sadness or connecting it to other sad experiences or allowing themselves to be sad in a given circumstances because like by definition boys don't cry. So that kind of like schema kind of blocking and preventing kind of the understanding of their emotions, and thus kind of will by default decrease their likelihood or ability or understanding that they need help. So one potential way that you can express kind of sadness or kind of dissatisfaction with life is to do so through anger, which is a much more appropriate emotional display for boys in a given culture within like a given historical period. So like a classic scenario of like a preschool kid like beating, I don't know, like teasing their classmates or something along those lines, kind of influenced by maybe some kind of stress in their household wherein they're kind of feeling sad or disconnected from their family, and kind of the way they express it, because they're a boy in the schema, is through, again, aggression, teasing, anger, or something along those lines. Social referencing, a process where we begin to understand our emotions by looking at how others react when we are uncertain about how we should react. Infants looked at two different people for social referencing in unfamiliar situations. Babies start laughing, for example, even though they have no idea what the hell is going on. People around them are laughing, so they're like, woo, I'm going to laugh. Baby crashes into something and looks at the guardians to see if he or she should cry or if it's fine. Pure expressions of fear toward a toy make an infant less likely to use that toy. Fathers' levels of anxiety also are predictive of behavior in uncertain situations in infants. So because kind of just having no experience like interacting with the world, the infant will look to these social cues to other people. Again, we are social mammals. And really the bedrock of our development is literally like this emotional development and human connection, social connection of other people, which then predict all kinds of other outcomes, not just social, but cognitive and all kinds of other life outcomes. And like some classic scenarios of this is like a baby falls down, and let's just say hypothetically it's fine, like whatever. They just like, oh, they fell on their butt or something, and they're like, they look to their parents and say the parents all of a sudden are like, or their guardians are like, oh man, this is a catastrophe, I'm having a meltdown, and then they're crying for whatever reason, even though there's literally nothing, and the kid, and then the kid starts crying or something along those lines, versus the parent being like, okay, woo, and just like laugh about it, maybe make it a little game. Again, this is assuming that like literally nothing has happened, and then the infant is like fine. You also see this like peers, as stated. Infants will look at other infants' apprehension or comfort with a toy and then kind of react accordingly. You can also see this with the boys example, as I said before. So combining that schema and social referencing points. So say a boy's like something, whatever, they get injured or something along those lines, or they're just sad for whatever reason. They got made fun of by their peers. So they'll look to their peers and say, oh, none of my peers are crying, therefore I'm not going to cry. So that's one mechanism through which schemas and those kind of gender roles are kind of socially reciprocated. Moving on to other emotions that are developed. Empathy experiences the feelings of others. Babies are more likely to start crying when they hear other babies crying. Lack of ability to emphasize is associated with adolescents who are sexually abusive, delinquent, and antisocial. Secure attachment associated with higher levels of empathy during adolescence. Sympathy is sharing another's distress, shown by helping/comforting. When parents frequently talk about emotions and mental states with their young children are more likely to show concern for others who are in distress, try to comfort the person, and share quickly and often when recognizing others are in need. So infants develop empathy, it's like kind of rudimentary understanding of empathy at a very young age. So understanding another baby's crying, they're going to start crying kind of thing. Again, very kind of basic human emotion, empathy. However, there is a developmental trajectory of empathy. You can have high levels of empathy, very low levels of empathy. And kind of a low level of empathy in adolescence, as stated, is associated with a whole host of antisocial problems, kind of for self-evident reasons. The decreased ability or kind of non-concern with the feelings of other people make you more likely to do harmful things or engage in just antisocial behavior in general. And one method through which empathy is developed is by parents kind of talking about emotions with their children. So kind of working through emotions, talking about mental states, that allows a child to kind of eventually kind of independently identify their emotions, work through why they're experiencing them, and hopefully find appropriate outlets to express those emotions. And in return, they can use that kind of knowledge to empathize with other people. So comfort the other person, share with them, again, kind of look for appropriate remedies to that are empathetic in nature. So whatever, a kid's crying, and you're like, okay, here's a toy. Woo, let's have some fun. Kind of, so trying to cheer them up kind of situation. This is rooted in because now a child understands their emotions, and they're also now able to understand emotions in other people. Again, kind of infant level, early childhood levels, but kind of that foundation is there that, as stated, is predictive of later life empathy, which is then predictive of all kinds of outcomes. Next, self-conscious emotions. They require children to think about how an event affects their evaluation of themselves. Secondary emotions develop later because they depend on awareness of self that young children do not yet possess. This is argued. These secondary emotions include guilt, pride, and shame. Embarrassment, guilt, and shame begin to emerge around 3 years of age, when children have a greater understanding of standards, rules, and goals of the society that they live in. Guilt results when children think about a specific behavior they have done that they regret, such as, quote, I did something bad. This creates a sense of remorse, want to do something to make it better. While shame, even though these constructs are a little very close together and it can be difficult to tease apart at times, we're going to operationally define it as occurring when the focus is on the aspect of ourselves that we believe we cannot change. That is, I am a bad person. So kind of the idea here is that cultures teach us standards, rules. What is our goal of our culture kind of thing? Like, what are we doing here? What's important? That takes kind of time to learn. And so as that is when a child is like learning that information and at the same time going through like rapid neurological development and cognitive development that allows a child to engage in more complex thinking and behavior. So you kind of have two processes of kind of this universal cognitive or neurological development alongside that cultural component, that environmental component, that national political component, where you're internalizing those values of a culture. And thus, when you violate those rules, in order to understand you violated the rules of society, you have to understand the rules of society. Thus, it takes time. And thus, it takes a little bit. Thus, like guilt can occur when you recognize what you did was in violation of some rules and standards of society. And for the purpose of this class, kind of our difference between guilt and shame is guilt kind of resulting from a specific action I did, and thus you recognize that action and then want to make amends for it, do something to make it better, fix that kind of a specific behavior or whatever the consequence of your behavior was, versus shame, much more like it's not a specific behavior I did, but rather fundamentally I am myself a bad person, versus I did something bad. It's also debated that if there's other universal emotions, such as contempt, shame, and interest. Pride has strong evidence of universality, involves entire body. That includes erect posture, head tilted back, slight smile, arms extending away or held akimbo, aka to the side. It's recognized in all culture sets so far, that is pride, and demonstrated even in blind judo wrestlers worldwide who have seen it themselves. So blind judo players will use similar body postures when displaying pride, which again suggests that there's some level of universality of pride. Temperament, tendency to respond in predictable ways, such as sociability and emotional reactivity, that serve as the building blocks of later personality. Some people are usually timid, fearful, and anxious. Others are outgoing. Easy temperament, and there's typically three types of temperament. There are other models, but these are kind of the classic three. Easy temperament generally have a positive mood. They adapt fairly easily to change and are regular and predictable in their patterns of eating, sleeping, and elimination. Difficult temperament, more negative mood, are easily frustrated and slow to adapt to change, and have irregular patterns of eating, sleeping, and elimination. Slower warm temperament, milder reaction to new experiences than that of a child with difficult temperament, but stronger than that of a child with an easy temperament. So kind of as stated here, these are kind of like, temperament is really kind of like the building blocks of really like emotional connectivity among them, I should say. And so for example, how you emotionally react to something can impact your willingness to engage with it, or maybe the willingness of the environment to engage with you. So for example, you're an easy temperament child, you meet new relatives, and you're like, woo, you're a happy baby, and everybody's treating you happy, and they're playing with each other, and you're kind of getting that emotional experience, versus maybe a more difficult temperament child who struggles with adapting to change, and thus maybe that could limit socialization opportunities because a child is introduced to a new adult, and then the child is kind of slow to adapt to that change, or easily frustrated and kind of resistant to that change. This is typically thought to be kind of genetic in nature, but I've worked with researchers who have tried to look at kind of the environmental impacts on genetic expression of kind of temperament. And you can see these are kind of like very broad. So how these end up playing out in the real world, there's a ton of variation of this. So these are very kind of like broad building blocks that can get molded through time to, or I should say, which result in kind of a wide variety of behaviors. Which brings us to goodness of fit. Argued that the fit between a child's characteristics and the demands of the social world / environment in which they must adapt are more predictive of development. For example, shy, inhibited children are likely to remain inhibited if their parents are either overprotective or angry and impatient, but can overcome inhibition if their parents create a, quote, good fit by preparing them for potentially upsetting experiences and making firm but reasonable demands. A parent may take an infant who is fearful of crowds / noises to those situations only when the parent and child are rested, fed, and comfortable. Prenatal stress, substance use, and genetics interact to shape temperaments. So kind of the idea here is that you have this maybe temperament or some kind of elements of the child's characteristics, and then you have the environment, which have sets of demands that exist within cultures or whatever, within school or within a work setting, but obviously these are babies, and it's not 1800, so they're not working the fields in general right now, at least in the US, that gets exported. Different story. But kind of the idea here is that you want those child's characteristics to kind of match up well to the demands of the environment. So you can almost kind of think of this like a puzzle piece, like fitting into whatever an appropriate puzzle hole shape kind of situation. And the degree to which a child's characteristics fit within that, that would be the child puzzle piece, I guess, and placed into that little puzzle hole situation. Degree to which it fits, the snugness of it, the goodness of it, is predictive of development. So it's not necessarily that those temperaments are predictive of, oh, this is the bad temperament, or this is the greatest temperament ever. Obviously, some are more difficult than others, but it's not kind of this locked in stone of, okay, you're X temperament, therefore you're going to have a negative development impact, but rather this goodness of fit situation. So for example, with parents with a shy inhibited kid, they can kind of exacerbate kind of the worst aspects of shyness, maybe just inability to or unwillingness to engage with other peers or other adults, thus kind of losing socialization opportunities, which then can result in kind of less peer or outcasts, or maybe just less social interaction, maybe prone to like anxiety or depression or something along those lines later in life. So kind of like that overprotectiveness can accidentally and unintentionally place a shy kid who needs social experience, they kind of strip those opportunities from the child. Or the other way around, you can recognize your child is shy and inhibited, and you're like, I don't care. I'm just going to throw this kid into the deep end, maximum amount of like social interaction immediately, and they'll figure it out. Well, in that case, that's not a great goodness of fit. What you're trying to do is kind of prepare the child for experiences that they're not used to. So you're kind of prepping them and helping them kind of develop those skills and work through those social scenarios in kind of a more intimate settings with people, parents, caregivers that they trust. So you're working on those skills, and you're placing demands on the child still, with hopes, kind of through a scaffolding approach, that they are able to interact in that environment and then thus kind of be a better fit within that environment. And interestingly, as like a sidebar, there's kind of goodness of fits between people at jobs, at certain universities. A lot of research about goodness of fit. Stability of temperament. Many children retain the same temperament over time, but many also change. Postnatal environments helps determine how adaptive particular temperamental qualities are on whether they persist or change. The culture that a child is growing up in values and encourages certain child characteristics over others. In a culture that values quiet / obedient children, there will be social pressure from parents and other adults / institutions to help a child who reacts loudly to his experiences to learn how to moderate these tendencies. Behaviors will be a better fit with the expectations of the environment. So you kind of have this temperament, easy, whatever, or a little more difficult, but then the kind of the degree to which you have a goodness of fit is going to be based on the environment. Like, where are the specific environmental demands? What values, what cultural display rules are present within a given culture, and that is going to impact how positively adaptable the particular temperament is. And then if a temperament is not common within a given kind of culture, there will be kind of a socialization process wherein maybe a child reacts differently. And this is occurring through the parents, through their schooling, through kind of adults in the environment, through probably other peers that they're interacting with. This does not mean it's all like uniform or anything like that, but there's kind of like a range of kind of acceptability you can that you can imagine. So again, you can see the impact of kind of culture impacting even these kind of relatively stable constructs of development. Emotional intelligence involves understanding and controlling one's own emotions, understanding the emotions of others, and being able to use all of this understanding to navigate human interactions successfully. Emotional regulation occurs when you adjust your feelings in order to cope with an experience. It allows you to adapt your emotional responses to a particular situation so that you'll be in a good position to exercise control that initiates appropriate responses to reach your goals. And self-control, broadly speaking, occurs when you control your behavior. So emotional intelligence is kind of like an umbrella term, really involving like empathy, understanding of your own emotions, and then through that kind of intelligence, that understanding of your emotions and other emotions, kind of just navigate the social world and kind of meet your goals in everyday life. Likewise, emotional regulation, a very, very broad term, kind of dealing with, well, really the regulation of your emotions. So adjusting your feelings, or at least your emotional expressive responses, in order to deal with whatever challenging circumstances are in front of you, or maybe positive emotions or positive circumstances that are in front of you. So some contexts, it's appropriate and okay to have a meltdown. Other situations, not so much appropriate. Or maybe you're arguing with your boss and you're like, hey, I really want to call this person a piece of shit and whatever, and yell at my boss, but hey, listen, I'm going to be fired if I do so. So I have to regulate my emotions in order to reach my goal, which in this case is just have a job and have financial stability. So the development of this is going to be very important, both emotional intelligence and emotional regulation. You can think of maybe a kid who attends pre-K for the first time, and maybe they don't have, or maybe they are underdeveloped in emotional regulation and emotional intelligence. So therefore, maybe they don't understand their own emotions. They don't understand their own their peers' emotions well, or at least at kind of their age level, and they don't regulate their emotions well. So now they're kind of like acting out. And one reason why young children end up kind of in antisocial peer groups or kind of like friendless is because they can't control like their emotions. So maybe they're expressing like anger, hitting another child, or maybe picking on them, or maybe they're just like crying and screaming constantly. And that's kind of like acts as like a social repellent, and then those kids kind of get isolated, and then maybe they stop engaging in school as much. Maybe they form friend groups with other antisocial peers, and you can kind of see how this social process unfolds and then gets linked to other important developmental outcomes. And as I laid out in my preschool kind of anger or just constant sadness example, when a person can control their expressions of emotions, they're more likely to be able to use emotions in a positive way, such as road rage, temper tantrum. So if you can't control your emotions, all of a sudden you're road raging, and then you're kind of out of control and putting yourself and other people at life's in jeopardy. Temper tantrum, a little lower stakes here, but ultimately you cannot control your emotions, or at least unwilling to, or something along those lines. So then you're kind of expressing it through kind of a negative way. Newborn infants have very little ability to regulate their own emotions until the frontal lobe of their brains becomes developed enough to regulate emotional impulses. Infants have little ability to moderate how they react to external events. They know how they are feeling and what they want in a given moment. The ability to regulate emotions is associated with higher levels of social competence, consciousness, sympathy, pro-social behavior, and lower levels of internalizing and externalizing problems throughout the lifespan. Poor self-regulation is associated with higher levels of aggression throughout childhood and adolescence. So as I've talked about, infants have very little kind of ability to kind of regulate their own emotions, or kind of deal with stress or anything, or kind of just deal with any external kind of issues that are occurring in their life. All they know is that something is overstimulating or something is bothering with them, and they have to cry to hopefully alert a caregiver to help soothe them and kind of deal with that stress. This is kind of referred to as the co-regulation of stress between parents and their children. And kind of dealing with that stress and those emotions in a kind of collective or like a family unit or whatever community unit way, again, kind of is associated with development of like emotional intelligence, emotional regulation. Because through time, you're talking to the child, and again, they kind of internalize how to understand their own emotions and thus understanding the emotion of others, and then are more willing, as stated, to engage in like pro-social behavior and all these other things. And in the absence of that ability to self-regulate, they're at higher risk of engaging in aggression. Again, you can't really control the emotions you're feeling. You maybe kind of like don't fully understand your emotions, and kind of thus you're just kind of like angry. Like you don't know how to control it. You don't exactly know what you're feeling. You don't understand the perspectives of other people as well. So kind of, I should say, it's underdeveloped. Not that you can't at all, but it's kind of an underdevelopment of those skills and those developmental outcomes. And thus frustration sets in, and one way you can express it is through kind of anger and aggression towards people in your community, people in your classroom, your parents, your siblings, etc. So kind of that co-regulation of stress, of just emotions, really serves as a building block for a whole host of not just social developmental outcomes, but a whole host of like lifetime outcomes, or at least adolescent outcomes, not just social, but cognitive, academic, and physical and mental health outcomes, as stated here, the lower levels of emotional regulation related to internalizing and externalizing problems. Continuing on with the regulation of emotions, infants must rely on caregivers to help regulate the amount of distress they experience. As stated, a co-regulation of stress process occurs, which is critical for development. This tells the child on a biological level about the environment, what expectations could be met, who is dependable, how must they adapt to survive a set of given circumstances? Being sensitive to an infant's signals helps the infant learn to regulate his or her own emotions, because he comes to understand that he doesn't need to get frantic to get a response from caregivers. These experiences shape behavioral and biological outcomes. An infant's first attempts at emotional regulation may involve self-soothing behaviors and subtle signaling, such as yawning, stretching, and turning away. Adults are powerful models for how to regulate and control emotions and behaviors for toddlers. Toddlers can learn that negative outbursts are appropriate. So, like we've covered already, a child is unable, infant has very limited ability to regulate their own emotions. They have a limited capacity of emotional intelligence, obviously some, which are kind of like universal, but kind of like that complex ability of, oh, I feel sad because blah, blah, blah happened to me, and therefore, let me think this through and have a rational thought of, oh, this isn't that bad, not happening. So they depend on their caregivers to help regulate their emotions, their stress, that co-regulation process. And this is important because, as stated, this tells the infant on some level of what to expect in the environment. That is, okay, if I cry or I have this overwhelming overstimulation, or I'm super stressed out and I'm crying, I'm asking for help all the time, 24/7, I'm trying to get any help, no one ever responds. Well, on like a rudimentary social level, but really kind of on a biological level, this is telling the child that this environment requires you handling things on your own. You can't really trust people. People are not going to be dependable, and thus you're going to have to adapt to that to survive in that environment. And that adaptation could, or one form of that adaptation could be within your stress response system. So maybe you have an underreactivity to stress. So thus, as a consequence, you are unable to pay attention to the world around you because, again, like you need some level of stress to pay attention and engage with the world. So kind of maybe you're under stress or basically understimulated because you've been taught kind of on a biological level that this world is so overstimulating, so stressful, there's nothing you can do, therefore I'm going to kind of like check out. Or conversely, you're going to be like super highly overreactive. But ultimately, the point is the adaptation has to occur to survive in that given circumstances. And that adaptation is going to have repercussions for future developmental outcomes on a biological level and on a social level. It's going to teach you how to interact with people because this is kind of your foundational experience. Now, that doesn't mean that's like unchanging forever kind of situation, but it's an important developmental period that it impacts you behaviorally and biologically and genetically for that matter. And also kind of just basic parental modeling, if a toddler sees their caregivers overreacting or just a sudden like a burst of aggression or just negativity in general, or punching something, I don't know, the toddler will come to understand that, oh, this is appropriate behavior given these circumstances. And thus, so you have kind of like maybe a combination of having to basically depend on yourself. Again, this is going on at a biological level, which then manifests like behavior a little later on. And at the same time, you're learning, oh, I guess I can deal with my issues through kind of just like anger. Emotion dismissing. Gottman, kind of a famous psychologist, argued that there are two ways that parents teach children to deal with emotions. Premise is a negative emotions are unpleasant and we need to find a way to address them. Emotion dismissing. When parents minimize the importance of negative emotions, they try to distract or cheer up the child so the negative emotion will pass quickly, such as, it's just a scratch, it's no big deal, come play. May inform the child that they do not understand how they are actually feeling, or their feelings are illegitimate / invalid. Parents with this approach often are uncomfortable with their own negative emotions, they want to prevent their child from experiencing them. Negative emotions are thus seen as signs of parental failure. Because parents spend less time discussing the range of emotions, a child may never learn how to properly express what they are feeling in words. So kind of the idea here is that parents understand that negativity is going to happen in the world. You're going to feel bad sometimes, like fact of life. It is a universal emotion, sadness. It happens. One way parents can kind of deal with this is like, hey, I'm just going to ignore all negative emotions at all because maybe you can imagine this from a good place of like empathy along these lines of like, oh, I don't want my child to feel bad ever because, it sucks. You're a parent and you care about your kid. What you're going to try and do here in this kind of emotional dismissing tactic, this technique, this way of parenting, is to kind of minimize the importance of negative emotions. So basically just try and distract, kind of cheer up, like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, and kind of move on with your life. So basically what you're saying is, you're not really actually understanding what it is you're feeling. You're not sad. It's actually not a big deal. And we really don't have to think it through. You don't, why you're feeling this way, and thus kind of you're limiting the opportunities to engage in kind of like parent-child or parent-guardian or whatever the form of the raising environment is, child raising environment is, you're reducing opportunities for that child to engage with and learn about their emotions, how to properly express them, and how to positively deal with them. So you're kind of reducing kind of the opportunities kind of to work with through that, and at the same time unintentionally saying like, hey, you actually don't understand what's going on in yourself, and which could then kind of decrease and contribute to the underdevelopment of kind of like emotional intelligence. Emotion coaching. When parents help their children explore and understand their feelings, this approach argues that helping children label their emotions and understand them can create an opportunity for the child to learn what they can do with them, or do to deal with them, I should say. They acknowledge the little scratch, that it can hurt, and that the child feels sad. As a child learns to label and understand their own emotions, it becomes easier for them to develop empathy and understand the emotions of others. After the parents validate emotions, a parent can discuss what the child can do to make the situation better. Children then internalize this process through time. So, as I stated, you're kind of, by dismissing emotions, you're kind of decreasing the social opportunities for a child to engage in ways of developing emotional intelligence and emotional regulation in a very intimate, close setting wherein they have theoretically trusting, positive social relationships with their caregivers. And then thus, because kind of emotional intelligence is related to empathy, you're going to accidentally increase the likelihood of a child developing lower levels of empathy and lower emotional intelligence, which then can result in all kinds of emotional, social, cognitive, and behavioral problems, as we kind of all laid out already. But however, if the parent kind of acknowledges the issue, acknowledges the child is identifying their emotions, and then kind of work through, okay, what is the severity of these emotions? What are your emotions? Through that process of like communicating about these emotions, the child will develop emotional intelligence, which then they can use to understand other people's emotions and thus kind of engage in empathy moving forward. So this process allows for internalization of the understanding of emotion, which then you can then take with you in the real world. This should remind you of kind of the Vygotsky model. And once again, you can see how emotion, social relationships are at the core of humanity's development, like a large species level, and then kind of at that, whatever, individual level. Next, self-control, and looking at one specific form, effortful control. This is broadly defined as the ability to consciously control their own behavior. There's kind of debates on what effortful control is and how it differs from executive function. It doesn't matter for this class. We're going to ride with this. Delay of gratification. Tests that assess whether children can resist the impulse to go for an immediate reward if they are promised a larger reward in the future. Can you delay too long? So kind of the idea, there's a bunch of different delay of gratification tasks. The classic marshmallow task we're kind of familiar with. Put a marshmallow in front of a child and see how long they can delay eating it in a room by themselves. Also, what you can do is say, okay, child, here's one marshmallow. You can eat it right now, or if you wait 10 minutes, you get 2 marshmallows. And theoretically, you want 2 marshmallows, but you have to delay in order to earn those two marshmallows. In Japanese culture, preschool educators believe that young children are capable of regulating their own behavior. Hansei, teachers use questions to guide children to evaluate their own behavior and think of ways they can improve. Rather than reprimanding the child for doing something they shouldn't, a teacher may ask a child if her classmates knew where she is, whether they're missing her, and whether they could start their activities without her. This leads the child to reflect on the consequences of behaviors from others and guide the child toward regulation of behaviors. Self-control has been associated with a number of positive outcomes in school-age children. When preschool children are taught to reframe the temptation by thinking of a marshmallow as a cloud or a cotton ball rather than a treat, they're able to wait longer for rewards. So kind of there's different cultural expectations of delay of gratifications, and in this Japanese example, you can see this technique wherein they are trying to get the child to think through and self-evaluate the consequences of their own behavior and things that they can do to better regulate their behavior and ways that they can improve. So instead of just like yelling and screaming at them, theoretically what you're doing is you're asking, okay, what are the social implications you're doing? Not just to yourself, but this is what the questions are getting at here. Do your classmates know where you are? Are they missing you? So you're kind of putting like a social burden on your peers. And you can see kind of the collectivist frame here. Even beyond collectivist frame, just kind of the impact of kind of basic social relations with each other and how the importance of like a group and working together like as a team is valued. And it's not just going to be in Japan. That's just a kind of feature of humanity. We are all a social species. As stated, self-control is associated with a number of positive outcomes, not just like self-control outcomes. It's related to high school dropout odds, the odds of engaging in antisocial behavior, kind of for just kind of self-evident reasons. You're kind of able to delay gratification of something, so thus you can do something you have to do and then wait to get rewarded later on. And then me and my girlfriends, one of our favorite topics is, can you delay gratification too long? So yes, it's beneficial to delay gratification, but could you actually delay too long and thus kind of like have an or I should say kind of less social experiences because you're delaying so long, you don't end up kind of engaging. You don't ever gratify. You don't ever do the thing as whatever, a group or yourself want to do or need to do. So maybe you're stuck in circumstances that you shouldn't be because you keep delaying, or there's some kind of just unfulfillment of life. Much more, this is not really a quiz on, but it's just something that my partner and I kind of think through, because most features and a lot of things in developmental psychology, I should say, like low levels of something, not great, medium levels, solid, good, and then high levels of things, oh, that's not great either. So they're like, so we just kind of think through, oh, wonder if you can delay too long. But again, all kind of theoretical. Let's jump to some specific emotional problems. We already alluded to internalizing and externalizing behaviors and outcomes. So let's jump into some more specifics. Externalizing or other directed behaviors are when children act out in negative ways on the environment. Internalizing or self-directed behaviors where children experience painful emotions and may do things that are hurtful to themselves. So it's inward, it's internal versus external. Fear and anxiety. Generally, older children have fewer fears than younger ones. They are better understanding of the world and coping strategies. There's a tendency for girls to be shyer than boys, or a higher willingness to display shyness than boys. You gotta be careful there. Just because you're observable does not mean that tendency isn't present in boys, but rather it might be kind of masked and kind of restrained due to like gender display rules or something along those lines. You see this in like autism as well. Sidebar, not quizzed on, but kind of a side point. Black U.S. Americans are more likely to report fear of death. White U.S. Americans more likely to report school-related fears. Hispanic U.S. Americans more likely to report family-related fears. So we have different kind of emotional problems, externalizing, so kind of acting out in negative ways, maybe just punching someone or something along those lines. Internalizing behaviors, typically related to like anxiety or something along those lines, just internal, or keeping kind of those painful emotions or acting out negatively, almost basically against yourself. Broadly speaking, on average, in the U.S., girls are more likely to have internalizing behaviors. Boys are more likely to have externalizing behaviors, although both boys and girls can have either sets of disorders. One possible reason for this is, among many other ones, is that girls are maybe more socialized to kind of internalize their emotions, not rock the boat as much, and thus kind of you have to like swallow those emotions, which may like kind of contribute to internalizing behaviors. Versus boys, again, are taught that it's more socially acceptable to engage in externalizing behaviors. So they can't really like understand that they're sad or kind of deal with that and process that information, but they can act out in kind of aggressive ways is much more kind of socially acceptable, within this kind of historical period. A little less so than it was like 60 years ago, but still kind of a thing that exists. Other emotional problems. There's a difference between fear and anxiety, or I should say the difference between fear and anxiety is not always evident. Fear is argued to be related to an actual real event, while anxiety is an anticipation of an event that may or may not occur. Anxiety disorder, when anxiety is so great that it interferes with everyday activities and causes a great deal of distress. The most common disorder among children and adolescents is associated with an increase of depression, substance use, and suicide. One mechanism or one biological mechanism of anxiety disorder is thought to deal with the amygdala, hyperactivity in people with anxiety disorders. That is, the amygdala is believed to be hyperactive in people with anxiety disorders. And one study I want to briefly touch on here is the study on the right-hand side, the interaction of adverse child experiences and gender as risk factors for depression and anxiety disorders in U.S. adult. And what this study found was that children exposed to 4 or more ACEs, adverse child events, had higher odds of anxiety and depression than children exposed to less than 4 ACEs. So again, you see similar themes, that doses effect that we've talked about before, and we see the impact of our life history on developing these disorders. Sadness and depression, beginning with major depression, one that is long-lasting and severe enough to affect the individual physically, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. 1 to 2% of children under the age of 12, 13% of U.S. adolescents have had at least one major depression episode, can be diagnosed in children as young as 3. Less than 40% of depressed teens receive treatment in the U.S., Adolescent girls are 3 times as likely to develop a depression. However, boys are socialized to express anger, and girls socialized to internalize feelings, which I discussed a few slides ago. We also have this rumination situation. Preschool children who are depressed are more likely to have later life depression. Major depressive episodes have increased from 2005 to 2017. Single-parent households, substance abuse disorders, U.S. natives, or being a U.S. native, sense of hopelessness, early childhood drama, body dissatisfaction are all associated with greater odds for major depressive disorder. So a couple of the key points here. We see that 40% of depressed teens receive treatment, and that's basically any treatment. It doesn't mean that, oh, this is great treatment. We're really addressing things here. It's just that you get anything. Well, so 60% basically getting nothing, and then 40%, I don't know what percentage of that is like good treatments or like addressing multiple kind of areas or contributors to depression, but they get something. So you can see here a very much under-resourced institution or whatever, a service within the United States. As stated, adolescent girls are about 3 times as likely. Again, could be related to this internalizing process that girls are taught in the U.S. So kind of like, I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to bother anyone with my emotions. Therefore, I'm going to keep it to myself. I'm going to internalize it, which can contribute maybe possibly to internalizing or higher odds of developing an internalizing disorder. Also, this process of rumination. So kind of using friends as emotional support is good. Like emotional support is good for anything. Emotional connection is always good. But kind of what can happen for adolescents, and one possible reason, another mechanism through which girls may be more at greater risk of developing a depressive disorder is this rumination. And kind of the idea here is that you're kind of just bouncing back and forth between, let's just say, a group of 2 people, 2 girls, adolescent girls, and they're basically just bouncing back and forth, basically their feelings of depression. They're not really solving anything, and they're not, frankly, moving on with their life, so they're just dwelling on it. They're ruminating on it through time, over and over and over again, and this is being socially reciprocated back and forth between those 2 friends, and thus they never have an opportunity to get over it, and they're actually constantly always thinking about the thing that's bothering them and really never kind of working through kind of next steps or anything along those lines. So that rumination process can actually unintentionally exacerbate the risk of developing a major depressive disorder or an internalizing disorder. And unsurprisingly, as I've stated throughout this class, you don't become magically a new person all of a sudden when you're an adolescent or you're just brand new. No, you're bringing your life history. Thus, preschool children or younger children who are depressed are more likely to have later life depression. That could be as adolescent or an adult, because you're going to have that kind of like accumulation of stressors, and probably you're going to all of a sudden kind of get into a developmental trajectory wherein you're doing things in kind of a depressive way. You're going to be in social circumstances where depression may emerge, or maybe you're in a very rough context. So maybe you're live in poverty and are interacting with very stressful events consistently. There's not a ton of social mobility / really any in the United States, so you're probably more likely to still be in poverty when you're 20 years old. So if you're 40 years old and you're in poverty for a long period of time, the longer you are in that, the more likely you are to be in poverty as like an adult, and thus kind of that accumulation, those environmental circumstances being more or less stable can kind of contribute to later life depression. And on kind of the right hand side, you can see here people who live in poverty are at higher risk of developing depression, asthma, obesity, diabetes, heart cancer, or heart attacks, cancer, high cholesterol, all kind of related to stressors, but as well kind of being exposed to pollutants, having less quality food, so kind of like more stress. More stressed out social connections, if they're, and then kind of lack of economic resources, lack of nutrients, which we've kind of talked about in our first beginning chapters about teratogens. So this is kind of an example. And interestingly, major depressive episodes have increased from 2005 to 2017. Which suggests us that either there's a magical genetic change that happened within 12 years, which is basically evolutionary impossible unless we are becoming like mutants or something, because evolutionary like genetic change takes a bit of time for this kind of thing to occur, or there's something in the environment contributing to increase depressive episodes in the United States. And what that is, I'll leave that to you to unpack. But I would suspect it would be some combination of economic recessions, existential threat about like climate change, a kind of a general sense of hopelessness and lack of a future. U.S. Americans are very isolated at this moment, like extremely atomized, isolated people. Not great, considering we're a social species, terminally online. So these environmental factors mixing together with other things going on, probably contributing to an increase in major depressive episodes during the last couple of decades. You also see this in rates of something called deaths of despair, aka suicide, drug overdose, trying to deal with that despair through drugs and then accidentally ODing and dying. Cognitive behavioral therapy, kind of the gold standard right now of therapy. There are other therapies and these kind of things come and go, but right now this is pretty consistent gold standard in the U.S. In cognitive behavioral therapy, a therapist helps the individual identify false or negative thoughts and replace them with more realistic ones. It works best with mild to moderate depression. Prevalence and characteristics of suicides. Girls may attempt suicide more often than boys. This is debated, but boys are more successful at committing suicide than girls. Boys use more lethal methods. U.S. natives, males, sexual minorities, people who live in poverty, youths who grew up in high adverse or who have high amounts of adverse child events, and substance use disorders are at higher risk of attempting suicide. Asking about suicide will not make it more likely that someone will think about it or do it. Suicide intervention programs, overall effectiveness of programs is weak. So kind of the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of working through your thought process while interacting with the world and trying to come to more beneficial or realistic understandings of the world. So kind of decrease catastrophizing, decrease kind of negative evaluation of things. So kind of this cognitive reframing yourself and the world around you, and this is kind of done to, again, trying to work through and change those negative thought processes, which then may contribute to certain behavioral outcomes and certain disorders development, such as depression. But again, it would kind of work best with a mild to moderate depression. Characteristics of suicide. Again, there's kind of a debate if girls attempt suicide more than boys. Some sources say they don't, some say they do, and it's only just a little. It's kind of very difficult to measure for self-evident reasons. But we do know that boys are more successful at committing suicide through girls, and this is, as stated, because of the methods. Girls are more likely to try and commit suicide through some combination of like pills or something like that, like poisoning kind of things. And what will end up happening is they will pass out, and then they will vomit up the pills, and then they will end up surviving. While boys are more likely to use more direct lethal methods, such as like a gun or a knife. And a couple key points I want to make here is that asking about suicide does not make it more likely that a person will think about it or do it. There's not like if you say the magic word, someone's going to go try and commit suicide. It doesn't work like that. So yes, you can engage your peers, people you're concerned about, and talk to them about suicide. Now, unfortunately, most of the suicide intervention programs that have been designed they have a very weak effectiveness. And you see this with kind of like a lot of programs, not just suicide programs. Rooted maybe in a lot of reasons. One reason could be because these kind of developmental outcomes are influenced by so many different things in that person's life. It's very difficult to not kind of address a lot of things at the same time and expect a developmental outcome to change. So what I'm saying is, because as I stated before, there's not just like one thing that it impacts all of development. In this case, one thing that causes a person to be suicidal, but rather a collection of their life experiences. So kind of there's some forms of therapy that, for example, try and bring in an entire family, or maybe a community-oriented therapy, or maybe therapy plus some kind of economic program, or something along those lines. Some kind of multifaceted approach may be more beneficial, but those are going to involve more public policy. And one thing I want to final thing I want to touch on with this is that 13 Reasons Why show, where we're like, woo, we're doing this to stop suicide. We get a cool Netflix show, and we also get to do good while just watching TV. Well, whoops. Unfortunately, NIH study found that 13 Reasons Why was associated with higher odds of suicide rates among U.S. youth. So so maybe obviously not nobody watching this designed 13 Reasons Why or put it on TV, but I'm going to speak in general terms. So maybe when we think about the potential consequences of putting something on TV, especially if you're going to say that the TV show is like, oh, this is so beneficial, this is great. Well, if you're going to take that approach, at least like kind of think it through and I don't know, do some more research. If you're just going to do it for entertainment, you don't care, that's one thing. But if you're going to pretend like, oh, this is a public service thing, we're making money and we're also doing good for the world, well, yeah, okay, cool. Well, maybe think that through next time. And this NIH study has suggested people have literally watching the show has also contributed to suicidal outcomes. Anger and aggression. Most children display low levels of aggression from toddlerhood through childhood. Some show a relatively high level early in development that decreases across time. A smaller group sees their aggression increase, while the smallest group starts with high levels of aggression and kind of maintains it. So for the majority of children, they have low levels of aggression that kind of decline through time. A smaller percentage see their levels of aggression increase, and of the smallest percentages, children who are very aggressive and they stay aggressive or become even more aggressive. And this is probably going to be related to a whole host of environmental and temperament-related issues. Which brings us to oppositional defiant disorder, a behavioral disorder where confrontation, defiance, and argumentativeness becomes a part of a persistent pattern of behavior. It's important to note for all these things, anxiety, depression, oppositional defiant disorder, all of these things are basically just extreme manifestations of normal behavior. So you're basically taking a normal kind of behavior, confrontation, defiance, and taking it to like the nth degree, to such an extent that a child can't really operate in the world around them, and then they have kind of damaging effects. The types of behaviors are normative, but the severity and frequency is what makes it a disorder. Argumentative with adults, tantrums, refusing to apply. Coercive family environment. This is described as where there's a pattern of confrontation, followed by opposition, followed by defeat for the parents and success for the child, and the pattern repeats and escalates. It is not the child's earlier difficult behavior that predicts the development of conduct problems, but rather the interaction with caregivers around these behaviors. Intervention programs can help break this cycle, but the younger the child is when the intervention is started, the more likely it will be successful. So kind of the idea here is that this is kind of like a social cycle. So a child, for example, or a parent or a caregiver will have some kind of confrontation, or arguing about something, and then the child like refuses to do what the parent says. And then the parent is like, oh, I give up. Okay, you can do whatever you want. And this kind of teaches the child that, okay, they just do whatever they want. They can be defiant. But this comes not just with normative behavior, but like to an extreme extent. Like they'll just do anything at this point. And then eventually engage in more kind of harmful behavior to themselves and or other people. So kind of the idea here is that it's not just the child's difficult behavior themselves, but kind of how you respond to that, which honestly can be quite difficult, obviously. So kind of breaking that cycle, or I should say programs are kind of designed to try and help break that cycle of a coercive family environment. We're kind of that opposition and then kind of defeat. And maybe at the same time, also then the parent is like, man, screw my child. This kid sucks. I'm going to treat them even worse. Which then the kid, even though they are still oppositional, they're still human and still have those same social needs. So now you've cut off some positive kind of social interactions, and now all you're left is with this negative kind of downward spiral. Dysregulation disorders. When children between 6 and 10 years of age have severe and recurrent temper outbursts that are grossly out of proportion in intensity or duration to the situation, 3 or more times per week. It was just added to DSM-5, which is the newest DSM, so it's debated if this disorder is actually different than oppositional defiant disorder. Which, again, maybe it is, maybe not, so we don't know. Things go in and out of the DSM like all the time. There's a lot of critiques about the DSM, not for this class. Conduct disorder, repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rules of others or major age-appropriate social norms or rules are violated. About somewhere between, I'll just say 5% of the U.S. population have this disorder. It's higher in boys. OCD increases the odds of CD later in life. So oppositional defiant disorder increases the odds of conduct disorder developing in later childhood. And finally, we have this treatment approach, this multi-systemic treatment, MST. This approach for treating conduct disorder examines many levels of influence that may be contributing to the problem and have the therapist and family work together. They use the ecological theory, that is Bronfenbrenner, examine influences from family, peers, schools, and communities. So like I said before with that suicide prevention program, kind of because developmental influence or developmental outcomes are influenced by so many things, this kind of multi-systemic approach tries to work through that. So maybe work with parents, work with teachers, work with grandparents, work with friends, work with whatever, their community, something along those lines, all trying to come together to kind of address this disorder. Which again requires a lot of time, a lot of resources. This is where like public policy and psychology interact here, and maybe even of like, oh, maybe a different macro system is needed. You know, this is where customs change, political values change, political systems change, economic system change, and kind of response to these kind of things. And our last big topic will be attachment, a very heavily researched area. Attachment, a strong affectional tie that binds a person to an intimate companion. A behavioral system through which humans regulate their emotional distress when under threat and achieve security by seeking proximity to another person. Secure attachment is defined as a strong, positive emotional bond with a particular person who provides comfort and a sense of security. When an infant recognizes a caregiver cannot be for them or be there for them, they must adapt to meet these environmental challenges. So attachment allows for a very, very special kind of bond between caregivers and the child, which then allows or gives kind of a secure base through which a child can co-regulate their emotional distress, their stressors, as we've already talked about, in a kind of a safe environment. This teaches the child that, okay, when I have kind of emotional distress, I can depend on other human beings to be there for me, to give me a sense of security, and then I can maybe go back out and interact with the world again, because I'll always have this kind of emotional security base with me. However, again, if the caregiver cannot be there for the child for whatever reason, the child must adapt, and then thus, on a biological level, this will impact certain epigenetic expressions. It'll impact stress response systems. Maybe hyperactivity of certain brain regions, but ultimately, and that's on a biological level, and then on a social level, it's kind of just like an expectation that the world is not going to provide you a kind of a safe, a place where you can achieve security, safety, and comfort. So thus, you kind of like have to interact with the world in that way, in a way that has those circumstances. So basically, your expectations as a young human that are kind of evolutionary based, that need for attachment, are theoretically not fully met. And now it's like, okay, well, this is what my environment is. Now on a biological and a behavioral level, I have to adapt, which can be useful. You survive, but long term, this can be associated with increased odds for a whole host of negative developmental outcomes. The formation of a strong attachment has the positive effect of facilitating exploratory behavior, secure base, a point of safety from which an infant can feel to venture, and a safe haven an infant can return to for comfort if frightened. So kind of the idea is that you have like a home base kind of thing. You can think of this in like literal like military terms or whatever. So you go out and explore, you're learning about the world, you're interacting with the world, you're socializing with the world, you're just experiencing new things, whatever. And then it's like, okay, if I get a little overwhelmed, I can come back to my my caregivers who I'm attached to, and they can provide me with a source of emotional comfort. That will, allow me to regulate my emotions, develop emotional intelligence, and then I can go back into the world and explore again. You ultimately have someone you can depend on who, who has kind of like, or I should say, who kind of unconditionally kind of meets the needs of a child, which allows them to, again, engage with the world around them. In the absence of that, well, then it's like, well, I'm going to just have to either suppress these emotions, or I'm going to be super reactive to things because I have to be, because that is the environment that I am in. This is kind of my adaptation. There are thought to be 4 phases of attachment. The first, undiscriminating social responsiveness, about 2 to 3 months. Responsive to voices, faces, but any human interest in them, and by them, young infants. Discriminating social responsiveness. This begins to emerge around that 2 to 3 month mark and continues to the 6 to 7 month mark. Infants begin to show preferences for familiar companions. Direct biggest grins and babbles towards companions, still friendly with strangers. So you're going from this kind of like undifferentiated, undiscriminating social responsives, like, you're having a good time with anybody. You are, all humans kind of interest me. Again, broadly speaking, these are kind of crude categories, but much more interested in kind of humans. And any kind of level of social responsiveness is solid for you. And then you start to discriminate social responsiveness as you get older. You direct, as stated, kind of grins and babbles towards companions, people you start to bond with closely. Babbling is kind of like a marker of developmental achievement. So kind of directing that towards caregivers is kind of consistent with the importance of a caregiver. Next, we have something called true attachment, 6 to 7 months to 3 years. This is characterized as the first real attachments. Infants follow mother, protest when she leaves, greet warmly when she returns. Infants can become attached to fathers, siblings, grandparents, and babysitters as well. And then goal-corrected partnership, 3 years and older, taking a parent's goals and plans into consideration and adjusting their behaviors accordingly. Understand that when a parent leaves for work, they will come back and know where to wait for them. So kind of we have this first true attachment wherein now I'm really depending on that person for a secure base and kind of emotional co-regulation. I like deeply need that person. That person typically is a mother, but there's also attachment as well with fathers. Again, new research out of this for fathers, siblings, grandparents, and the importance of these attachments to developmental outcomes as well. And then what happens, this goal-directed partnership is basically just the recognition that, oh, you're a person that you're attached to or people you are attached to have their own lives. And they operate in the world independently of you. There is a self that exists beyond immediately you. And thus, you kind of have to adapt to that and adjust your behavior accordingly because you understand they have a life, they have a self. You fully don't understand what that means, but hey, they're going to come back and I will survive because now I have a greater understanding of myself and my caregivers. One way this is measured is through this classic study called the Ainsworth Strain Situation Task, a laboratory procedure designed to evaluate attachment styles by observing 1-year-olds' reactions to being separated from and then reuniting with their primary caregivers. So basically what happens is an infant and a mother are in a room, typically is how the research is set up. Again, probably new research is coming out with grandparents and these other attachment figures, but kind of the classic thing, like all psychology, very a one-to-one situation, infant mother, you put them both in a room and then you let the infant like play around for a little bit and then you have the mother leave the room. And then at the whole time, like researchers are filming this and they're taking basically notes. There's a way that you can code behaviors. So they're coding like infant behaviors when the mother leaves a room. Then what sometimes will happen is a stranger will enter a room, thus a strange situation. The stranger will maybe interact with the child or maybe they'll stand there for a minute. Again, the researchers are taking notes during the entire time. And then what happens, the stranger will leave, and then like, I don't know, 10 seconds later, the mother will walk back into the room, and then the researchers will code how the infant reacts to the mother's return to the room. And then there are 4 different types of attachment, and these percentages are from one study in the US. So we're going to walk through some of the forms of attachment. First is secure attachment, the infant caregiver bond or intimate relationship in which the individual welcomes close contact, and by individual I mean the toddler or the young child, infant, uses the attachment object as a source of comfort and dislikes, but can manage separations. So kind of during that reunion process, the infant is showing, was welcoming the caregiver back into the room, and they're using the caregiver as a source of comfort because they're stressed out being alone and also seeing a stranger, like some ominous guy or something along those lines. And they can deal, like separation is not the most pleasant thing in the world, but they can deal with it. Ambivalent resistant attachment, this is referred to as insecure infant. This is characterized by strong separation anxiety and a tendency to show ambivalent reactions to the attachment object upon return, and by object I mean caregiver, seeking and yet resisting contact and not being comforted. The caregiver does not consistently respond to the infant's cues. The infant is reluctant to move away from the caregiver to explore, distressed when a caregiver leaves, but does not let a stranger comfort him, is not comforted by the return of the caregiver either. Want to approach caregiver, but also appears resistant to attempts to pick up the child. So kind of the idea and interpretation of this attachment is that kind of through non-consistent response to the infant's cues. So it's not that, you never respond, it's like pure neglect, but kind of some level of inconsistency for whatever reason. It creates this kind of ambivalent attachment, wherein on one hand they're kind of reluctant to move away and to explore, so they're losing that opportunity to actively explore and socialize in their immediate environment, because maybe they are not certain that the parent will be able to co-regulate their emotional distress in a consistent way. So maybe they're less likely to kind of engage in that exploratory, potentially quote unquote dangerous, exploration. We're talking a toddler here. They're not thinking in like these exact terms, but kind of on a biological, evolutionary kind of level. You're kind of broadly like acting and thinking this way. Infant is reluctant to move away, as I stated, and they do get distressed when the caregiver leaves, which again indicates that yes, that caregiver is a source of comfort, but again, not at all times. They thus again are kind of a little reluctant or not fully comforted when the caregiver leaves. So they're kind of distressed by it. So thus telling you that, oh, it is painful that this caregiver is leaving, and maybe even a little too painful. But maybe it's a little too painful because you don't know if that person is coming back or not, because again, that kind of inconsistency, and thus also that inconsistency could be also manifested through this reluctance, this ambivalence to kind of being comforted in the return of the caregiver, because you do not know if the caregiver will respond to your cues, or they will approach but not want to be picked up. So again, kind of this halfway, like, I'm not really sure what I want to do, thus kind of the ambivalent status. Next, avoidant, an insecure infant caregiver bond or other intimate relationship characterized by little separation anxiety and a tendency to avoid or ignore the attachment object upon reunion. Infant has learned not to rely on help and support from caregivers. So at this point, the infant, no way. Like this caregiver is unreliable. It's not sometimes or whatever, or most times, or maybe it is, but at that point, they're just like, they've given up. They're not chasing the, oh, maybe this will be the time. So maybe it's inconsistent. They've given up on that, or it's just like not reliable. It's even less reliable, and they've just given up. So it's just like, at this point, you're not going to rely on your caregiver for help. You're not seeking support from them. You're just going to deal with it yourself, and also possibly avoid and ignore that figure when they return, because it's not that person is not a sense of comfort. Thus, you're going to have little separation anxiety because you don't depend on that person to kind of soothe your anxiety. All things that can be problematic later on in life. And then we have disorganized, disoriented attachment, an insecure infant. Caregiver bond is common among abused children. This combines features of the resistant and avoidant attachment styles and is characterized by the infant's dazed response to reunion, confusion about whether to approach or avoid. Caregiver is a source of fear. They don't know where to turn, does not have a predictable environment. So in this case, for abused children, now we have like, I'm maybe ambivalent. I'm like, you're kind of inconsistent, but you're not maybe actively abusing me, like physically speaking. Or we have the avoidant where it's like, I've given up on you, dude. Like, I'm done riding on my own. Again, you might not be actively abusing me, but you're just not reliable. Here we have like, no, the caregiver is like, is a source of fear. So it's like, dude, I don't know where to approach. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to rely on. My environment is unpredictable. Thus, they're going to engage in kind of almost like chaotic behavior, wherein they're doing different forms or different behaviors associated with different insecure attachment styles, which is kind of characteristics of abused child. Some other biology of attachment: hormones prepare caregivers to be sensitive and responsive to infant cues. Hormones promote infants' tendency to stay close to caregivers. Stress is associated with the release of the hormone cortisol, activation of the fight or flight response, and the functioning of the immune system. Ambivalently attached infants are uncertain of caregivers' response patterns when they need help, I should say. They become hypervigilant, and stress response systems overreact to potential threats with high levels of cortisol, keeps them in a state of alarm. So here we kind of have hormones, again, this biological, like universal process wherein you have a child and certain hormones are released within the child and the parents to kind of respond and be sensitive to infant cues, in evolutionary speaking. So then one of the many reasons you love your kid and are responsive and more theoretically more patient when kind of raising your child. Stress in return, we've talked about cortisol in the past, so connecting cortisol specifically to ambivalently attached infants. Some studies have found that the ambivalently attached infant is kind of in a state of like hypervigilance. It has like an high overreactive stress response system, kind of keeping them at a state of like, on a scale of 1 to 10 at an 11. So maybe you can imagine as like playing out behaviorally, like something like, I don't know if this is going to be the time or not that this person is going to be there for me, be in touch with my infant cues. Therefore, like on a biological, again, this is all occurring at a biological level, like your biology literally, again, adapting to your environment. We are shaped by our environment, including our physiological systems. So you're like, oh, I don't know if my caregiver is going to be here for me. I don't know if I'm going to have that comfort. So instead, you're kind of like in a state of like heightened like alert at all times. Like you don't know where the comfort's going to be there, not going to be there, where your caregiver actually may act as a source of stress because you're like, oh, my caregiver is going to be there. Oh wait, they're not here. Oh shit, I'm super stressed out now. I'm even more stressed out. So kind of you can see how this like this process can play out on a biological level. And when I say like, oh, I'm really stressed out, I'm talking about elevated levels of cortisol. Broadly speaking, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's fine for the purposes of this example in class. Well, avoidantly attached infants rely on strategies to minimize the stress. They distance themselves from others so their system underreacts, and by system I mean stress response system, underreacts in the face of threat. A secure attachment allows an infant to expect others to be available in responsive and flexible ways. They can turn to others when they need support. This helps regulate emotions and thus physiological responses to stress. It helps infants develop strategies that help regulate emotions and develop self-control. So kind of the idea of avoidance is, again, you're kind of avoiding your caregiver. You've given up on them. Like they're not a sign of support at all. So you've kind of learned that people in the world are like not reliable. I got to do this on my own. That's what you can see through time. And yes, I fixed that typo. You can create social distance between yourself and others because you've grown up understanding that you cannot rely on other people to be there for you. And also what ends up happening is people with this form of attachment have kind of greater odds of kind of avoiding like social circumstances in general because they kind of have like survived and adapted to survive in their environment by kind of having an underreactive like stress response system. And again, these are broad generalities and there are differences that can occur. This is kind of just like one potential pathway here. So you have a kind of underreactive stress response system because if you think it through, okay, you can't depend on anybody in the world. So it's like, that's kind of emotionally damaging. So one way you deal with that is kind of like numb yourself or create emotional distance between yourself and others, which then though costs you because now you have less kind of social developmental opportunities. You have less opportunities to form new positive social bonds with people and kind of less opportunities to engage in behaviors where there's kind of a lot more things going on. Like there's a lot of activity. It's a little more stressful, a little more high energy. You kind of can't deal with that at the same level as maybe a more secure attached person can. And now this can change through time, but this is these things tend to kind of socially reinforce themselves by people actively avoiding certain social circumstances, distancing themselves from others, which then you have like a cascading effect going on. So you're almost kind of trying to like preserve that underreactivity to stress because dealing with certain levels of stress or maybe getting too close to someone is just something that like you physiologically and socially and mentally like can't like deal with. So again, seeing that connection between biology, kind of human expectations of closeness and connection, social connections with people, and then that adaptation process and how that plays out in the world. Versus kind of the secure attachment, they can come to recognize that you can turn to other people for emotional support. Again, this can regulate your own emotions because now you can engage in that emotional regulation process, thus kind of develop more appropriate and positive physiological responses to stress. It's not that you never get stressed out, is that, okay, stress happens. So at times, hey, stress is going to be overwhelming, but you can bounce back. You can better deal with it. You have better, more positive social connections that you can depend on to help kind of regulate that, not just as a child, but also as an adult. And then on the right-hand side, I wanted to include kind of some background information about one study that looked at higher ACEs and less nurturing attitudes were correlated with harsh parenting attitudes. ACEs were associated with harsh parenting attitudes, suggesting a buffering effect of PACEs, which is protective and compensatory, well said, events. So just basically protective factors or events. There's all kinds of different terms for this. So here you can see that the impacts of adverse child life events impact your parenting styles. So if you experience a lot of ACEs growing up, you're more likely, you have higher odds of engaging in harsh parenting styles, and then you kind of get that intergenerational kind of effect going on. But at the same time, you also still have these protective factors. So even children who may be more insecure attached in the right environments with the right protective factors can still have positive developmental outcomes. So it's not the end of the world kind of situation here, but it is, again, something that society, should be mindful of. And again, calling into question kind of these macro kind of solutions to these kind of things, which would then theoretically kind of trickle down to more community level and family level parenting. Some predictors of secure attachment: a good social support system, a positive relationship with a partner, good psychological health, a history of good care in their own childhood, and the cumulative effects of employment, class, economic variables. All these variables naturally co-vary. So a lot of things can be, are predictive of attachment between parents and or caregivers and the child, including, again, kind of emotional resources, social resources, maybe that can include in the family, within the partnership or marriage, whatever, good health in general, and then kind of just that life history. How much stress have you been exposed to, and how much have you learned kind of to like regulate your own kind of issues that have developed through time, which frankly can be easier said than done when there's just like when you've experienced a ton of ages and still living in very adverse, tough environments. Other implications for early attachment: studies of institutionalized Romanian children adopted by U.S. American, UK, and Canadian families. Children who were adopted before 1 year of age have a good chance of becoming as securely attached to their caregivers as a child who was never institutionalized. However, after 1 year of institutionalization, high rates of insecure and disturbed attachment. This is a super famous study, and really there's a ton of studies associated with this, basically looking at the impact of, due to these Romania's country's policies at the time, this mass institutionalization of children and how that impacted them developmentally. And basically the idea here, again, a dosage effect. The longer they're in this institution, the more likely they are to experience negative developmental outcomes, such as insecure attachment. Attachment continues to be valuable during adolescence. Adolescents need the security and encouragement to explore, to become independent and autonomous individuals. Again, those are kind of culturally stated values. Other values can be developed as well through attachment. This is really kind of that broad, generic kind of U.S. characterization. This is provided by supportive parents. Adolescents with secure parent-child attachments have greater odds of a stronger sense of identity, greater social competence, better emotional adjustment, fewer behavioral problems, form higher quality attachment to friends and later romantic partners than adolescents with insecure attachments to their parents. So yes, attachment still plays a key role during adolescence. It is not just when your child is like 1 year or whatever, 3 years old. Most parent-child relationships are close during adolescence. It is rare for a parent-child relationship to suddenly turn bad. Troubled parent-adolescent relationships have grown out of a troubled parent-child relationship. Conflict increases temporarily during puberty, but mainly is about little minor issues, homework, chores, minor disobedience issues, and adolescents do spend more time with their peers during adolescence. So kind of in general, I've said in this already, and I will say it probably in every chapter, you don't become a magically new person. Those people, those dyads, that is parent-child relationships that were already troubled, are more likely to have a troubled relationship as adolescent. That's just how it works for a whole host of reasons. And as stated, and there's kind of like this trope of like, oh, adolescents are out of control. Most of the issues in general, conflict increases only temporarily and then decreases through time. And it's generally about minor issues and kind of differences in the opinion of what is like a moral necessity or versus kind of like something that's kind of like a social convention or kind of just like an optional norm. And I talk about this far more in my adolescent psych class. We'll wrap it up with attachment and culture. In stressful circumstances, all infants show attachment behaviors and have preferential bonds with one or more caregivers. There's variation in proportion of infants in the categories of insecure attachment across cultures. One key point there, though, is how cultures define secure attachment varies. Attachment socializes you into your environment. A primary mechanism of development is an adaptation to your environment. Different contexts have different expectations of behavior, which impacts the interpretation of child and caregiver behaviors. What a, quote, good mother is varies across culture. So we find in studies that different cultures have different levels of insecure attachment and secure attachment, and that could just be a feature of that culture. But at the same time, different cultures, because they grow up in different environments and have different expectations about the world around them, can describe certain behaviors as secure So one culture can describe a behavior as secure attachment, while a different culture may describe a slightly different behavior as secure attachment. So ultimately, what you're trying to do through this kind of attachment process is, again, that co-regulation of stress that socializes you, that adapts you to your environment to know what to expect as a adult. And those expectations, those cultural values vary across culture. So thus, what a good parent is can vary within there is a range of behaviors where in like, oh, killing your kid, no, there's no culture where like, yeah, me just killing my kid, that's going to be secure attachment. No. But, broadly speaking, within a certain set of cultures, values, certain different behaviors, and thus different behaviors in some cultures will be described as secure, and in other cultures that may not be described as like secure or behaviors that are indicative of a secure attachment. So let's jump into some specifics. In mainland U.S., which is associated with autonomy and self-determination, broadly speaking. Secure children mean moving away from parents and playing independently. Japan, more likely to see a secure attachment as harmony with others and being cooperative and well-behaved. In Puerto Rico and Muslim households, obedience and respect for others indicates secure attachments. The Efe in the Democratic Republic of the Congo pass newborn babies among a group of women who hold, carry, and nurse the babies. And some tribes in the Congo Basin rainforest raise their children collectively. By only a couple of weeks old, an infant in this context has interacted with 20 different caregivers across time. Through these early social interactions, infants are being socialized to fit into social network structures. So again, you can see kind of differences in how we describe what secure attachment is. So in like mainland US, we have this idea of like, yeah, we're independent or whatever, and self-determination / really not exactly true. You don't really have a lot of self-determination and independence in your job. You can just do what your boss says, but whatever. We have this idea that we are all like kind of independent or whatever. In Japan, we see secure attachment being much more collective, again, broadly stated with all the caveats, dealing with like harmony, cooperation, that is secure attachment, maybe respect for the family, that familialism in Puerto Rican households and Muslim households. And I think among the most, to me at least, because of bias towards Congo, the most interesting one here is this massive amount of socialization and potential attachment for these infants in some tribes in the Congo Basin rainforest, wherein you're interacting with all these different community members and thus possibly forming attachments with all of them. I don't know, 20 plus of the caregivers. So you're really seeing not just one-to-one bonds, but this collective socialization process being formed in real time. You're integrating that child into a complex social network that they will need to navigate as adults. So maybe it's not just co-regulation of stress or emotional distress in this context, but like a larger, even more collective, like a community kind of regulation of stress, which is like super interesting of like how you would measure that. And it is kind of different than our traditional understanding of attachment. So with that said, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you sticking with me, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.